Hi, everybody. Welcome to the third session of the third day of the Humanitarian Congress in Berlin. Today, we will be... Sorry, I hear myself. Do you guys hear this also? No? Okay. No. Sorry, I have some resonance issues. Anyway, it's the third session of the third day of the Humanitarian Congress. Today, we will be talking about... I know why. Now it stopped. It's because I had this on the side. Sorry. It's much easier to concentrate now. Again, today we will be talking in a session that is a part of the wider climate justice discussion. And the topic of this session will be around what do greener humanitarian activities look like, examples and innovations. With me, very lucky to have two great panelists, Gemma Artisan, Water, Sanitation and Hygiene Consultant at the IOM, that's the UN migration body, and also Anna Livak, that is Sustainable Development Specialist at ICRC. I will let you introduce yourselves in a little while. My name is Smart Msf. I'm Innovation Lead at the MSF Sweden Innovation Unit. And today we will start by introducing ourselves, then we will move into the wider discussion block and finalize with hopefully some questions that we will have gathered during the day. But please, all the audience, wherever you are, feel free to submit questions throughout the sessions, and we will take them up as we can, but also to save a couple of them at the end. At this point, I would like to just say that we heard some great sessions earlier today. Some of them already brought up the importance to look into these aspects of greener humanitarian activities, the way that we as humans consume resources today in an unprecedented way, and also how we do it is really affecting the world we live in. And this has drastic effects on the environment and also on climate change. So we will start looking into certain areas that looks into the examples of the innovation, but we also want to have this as the starting point and then expand a bit beyond that. Just to move on, I also want to say that I will have two hats today. So I will be sharing the session, but I will also be presenting some of my own experience through the work that I've been doing. So maybe then I would just like to ask Gemma to introduce yourself and what you do.
Sure, thanks, Marpe. As you mentioned, my name is Gemma Artisan and I am a Water, Sanitation and Hygiene Officer for IOM. For those of you that don't know, IOM is the leading intergovernmental organisation in the field of migration, and we work closely with a variety of government, intergovernmental and non-government partners. As part of the IOM Global WASH support team, I help provide technical and strategic advice to IOM's global missions. And IOM WASH has the aim of providing life-saving, long-term and sustainable access to safe water and sanitation, while also promoting good hygiene and with the overall aim of improving public health and saving lives. Obviously, this is very relevant to today's conversation, which I'm really looking forward to, just given that WASH programs obviously have a heavy reliance on a healthy environment to deliver effective interventions, given that obviously we rely on a healthy water source to provide safe water to people. Sanitation as well has large implications on the environment in terms of water runoff, as well. Waste management is part of WASH's responsibility for those that are familiar with the humanitarian clusters. So that obviously has large impacts on the environment as well. And we really aim to consider the environment as a cross-cutting issue in all of WASH programming. So looking at technologies and approaches, as well as governance and at the local level through community resilience, and I'm sure we'll talk on each of these topics more today. One last thing that I wanted to mention was a specific project that we're working on, which is funded by Innovation Norway, which is about greening humanitarian response through recovery, repair and recycling of solar products in displacement settings. So I hope to bring some concrete examples from that to the discussion today. Thanks for having me.
Thanks a lot, Gemma. Anna.
Thank you, and greetings to everybody who joined us today for this session. So my name is Anna Livak, and I work for the International Committee of the Red Cross. I am part of the Environment and Climate Change team, and in a nutshell, this team is in charge of reducing the environmental impact of the organization, but also integrating climate and environmental considerations into our activities. So very much in a nutshell. So supporting the team, working on various transversal projects together with different departments in the organization. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So unlike the two of you, I really come a bit from the side in the environmental topic. My profile is really more in relation to humanitarian innovation. But I think it was in 2016 or 17 that me and my unit started to collaborate with some colleagues in the movement that work around energy. And the idea with that project was really to look into strategies and a long-term vision. The project was called the Energy Vision Project, on how we could assure more continuous energy provision, energy that was of high quality, but also safe for the staff and people around, right? And actually the sustainability aspect came during this project. It wasn't stated that, hey, we need to look into sustainable ways to acquire and produce energy, but this was something that came up during the course of this project. And this rendered then the energy vision that had a very strong sustainability component also in the end. Besides that, it also really mapped out some of the gaps that we had, and one major one was really access to data. We did not really know how much energy we were consuming. We didn't really know either for what functions we were using, and also how this contributed to, for example, emissions. So that was also one of the first kind of insights on the necessity to have good data, right? But besides this also led us to understand a bit more about the energy-related challenges. So our unit then, the Swedish Innovation Unit, started to look into different areas where we could use sustainable energy sources, basically solar panels, to provide solutions to our operational and medical needs. And one of those was a project we called Solar Oxygen, where we wanted to see how can we produce oxygen, therapeutic medical grade oxygen, where we need it the most, right? This is something that is really needed in order to provide healthcare, especially for small children, and especially in contexts where we don't have infrastructure to facilitate or to really make use of, for example, oxygen concentrators. But this was also more focused on the medical perspective. Another project we worked around was relating to solar-driven air conditioning, because we saw during the mapping of where our energy outlets come from or goes to, we saw that a big part of the generators consumption goes to to air conditioning, basically to cool our activities, whether it's operational theaters, intensive care units, or housing of staff. And this led us to several conclusions, right? And one of them was that it's really important to look beyond just the technology and the products. So we also started to work on another project that was really looking at the other end, that we call the Energy Behavior Change Project. And we did this actually together with the ICRC, because we felt that this is really an area where we need to collaborate with others. And that's maybe how I come in. There are, of course, also a lot of other activities ongoing within MSF. One of them is called Smart Msf, with the main focus on developing or implementing the environmental impact toolkit, again, back to the baseline data or the lack of it, right? This was an attempt to really better understand how we impact at different levels, both at HQ and at program level. Amongst other things, they also want to really find the pathways to reduce our carbon emissions and environmental footprint in general. So there has been an equivalent work there looking also into waste management, especially at program level. And also wider, we can see that from the change, I would say 5 years ago, right, when we basically didn't even consider sustainability aspects looking into energy, or it wasn't high priority, to today there is a big shift. And we can also see now that there has been an environmental pact that has been unanimously endorsed by the decision-making bodies within MSF, the General Assembly, the directors, the international and board, and so on, that really looks into the broader aspects of planetary health, how we can mitigate, adapt our operations, but also how we can speak out through advocacy or témoignage kind of activities. In addition, it also highlights the necessity to collaborate and to hold ourselves accountable. In addition, and I'm not going to go too much into details about the complexities of MSF, we are 5 operational centers. And maybe one of the advantages here is that one of them has actually pledged to reduce the carbon emissions with 50% by 2030 compared to 2019 emissions. With that said, I think I speak for us and the wider sector and the world in general that we have so much to do, right? We are still very much in the beginning still. And even though we need to do things in the right time, right, we need to be able to walk before we can run, and we need to be able to crawl before we can walk. We probably need to fasten the pace on how we learn to do these things. So I want to move on here a bit into a more fundamental question, maybe, and ask the two of you what you think is the responsibilities of humanitarian actors to really, well, not just do greener activities, but maybe as a start to transform ourselves into perhaps I wouldn't dare to say that we would be climate neutral, but at least to be much more efficient and cleaner in the way that we operate. So yeah, anybody that feels like taking the lead on this discussion, Gemma or Anna, please.
Gemma, or should I start first?
Go ahead, Gemma.
Go for it.
Okay, so no, I think that there is really a recognition in the humanitarian sector that we have this responsibility, and this has been reflected in the recently adopted Climate and Environment Charter that was jointly developed by the ICRC and IFRC. And today there is more than 150 organizations that have signed this charter, and this number is growing every day. So really, this charter serves as a guidance for the sector to actually, face the environment change crisis and build a roadmap to work on this together. But I think so this recognition and this responsibility can really be understood in 2 ways. So as you mentioned, pretty straightforward. We humanitarian activities do have an impact. We do emit greenhouse gas emissions. We do create waste, sometimes even hazardous, like e-waste or medical waste. And we do use resources as energy and water resources. So we have this responsibility to reduce our impact. But I think the second element is what you mentioned, like we work with people who are really vulnerable, and they are disproportionately affected by environmental degradation and climate change, and they have least assets basically to deal with these consequences, least capacity to deal with them. And at the same time, we are really in proximity to these people, and I think we're best placed basically to help them to adapt, to develop the resilience, the adaptive capacity. And we also have to prepare ourselves to adapt our operations so that we can actually meet these growing needs of people that we serve.
Thanks, Anna. Gemma, you want to add something to that?
Yeah, certainly. I very much echo what Anna was saying. I think as humanitarians, we're bound by all of these agreements and principles, and whilst not traditionally, essentially they are inextricably linked to the environment. I mean, what Anna was saying, really accountability to affected populations, which is something that we're all quite familiar with, and that commitment by humanitarian actors to use power responsibly. And I think that really should include the environment, because accountability to them includes the environment within which they reside, and making sure that that's safe and healthy for them to develop. Also, the principle of do no harm, whilst essentially or traditionally it's focused on people, that can also include the environment, because humans are so linked to the environment. Even the principle, the humanitarian principles, the principle of humanity, again, which is about saving lives and alleviating suffering. When you really think about it, to save lives and alleviate suffering, we need the environment to be healthy as well. Something that's, I guess it's not so new anymore, but the new ways of working from the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016 talked about the humanitarian development peace nexus, and there's this recognition that as humanitarians, in humanitarian response, we really need to be thinking about long-term development, and of course that always includes the environment, because without the environment in the long term, then anything we do for short-term life-saving purposes, it will only contribute to environmental degradation if we don't consider it from the outset.
Thanks a lot. No, I couldn't agree more with what you're saying, and especially the do no harm principle is something that MSF as an organization holds high as a principle. And if we do not consider the negative impact that we also have as an organization, then we're really bypassing that, right? And also, I heard something very interesting in the first session of today, talking about the health argument, right? Also, that this affects the health of people everywhere, and mostly those that are in the kind of environments we work in, right? That are disproportionately affected by environmental degradation and climate change. Let's hold this a bit, this kind of more imperative kind of discussions of what is the need for us to really improve the way that we operate. Maybe I would like to hear some more concrete examples. I mean, the session of today was really also about looking into innovations and examples on how we can do this, right? So we have some concrete things that we can share with the audience. And obviously, this is just a snapshot. There are so many different things, but again, interesting to hear. Anna, maybe you have something you would like to share from your side.
Yes, I mean, ICRC has been working both on reducing our impact, but also, as I mentioned before, helping people to adapt to the changes that are happening already. And I think a good example and a priority area for us where we operate and try to target, I mean, the adaptive capacity is obviously Sahel, which is really hit hard by the climate change, and basically what we aim at is to help people be resilient and also prepare for the changing patterns of the rainfall, the droughts, and the consequences of that. So, for example, in Niger, we are developing hydroponic green fodder banks for communities so that they can prepare for these times of crisis and be sort of independent of the distribution of fodder for their animals, which are actually their livelihoods. So very important for the well-being, health, and the survival of the communities. We have a similar approach in Mali, where we have community managed silos for seeds and also for fodder for animals. Again, addressing the issue of changing weather patterns and droughts, and basically which undermine the livelihoods of people. In Nigeria, we have trained local craftsmen to rebuild homes for people who were displaced internally using stabilized soil bricks. So this is sort of like an innovation that is actually not that new, because it's a more traditional way of building, constructing, which is I think it's good in the African context, works pretty well because it's eco-friendly. You don't have to burn these bricks basically to prepare them for the constructions. They are cheaper, they are easier to use, faster to use, and by training people, local people, to actually be able to create these bricks, we are helping them to develop skills that they can use in the future. Another example is really in Gaza, where we have a lot of activities that target rehabilitating existing water infrastructure, because obviously water access is affected by climate change, but also the infrastructure in the country or in the area where we work. So instead of digging new boreholes or walls, we're looking at rehabilitating existing infrastructure, which helps to reduce the environmental impact. But also we do it with local communities, local authorities, to help them develop the skills to manage the water properly. And we try to also, whenever possible, improve the energetic performance of this water system. So introducing technology such as solar panels. And to have this more holistic approach, we also have programs which where we construct rainwater harvesting systems for agriculture. So that means we are saving the water, the drinking water, from being used in agriculture. So this way people have better access to water. So these are just a few examples, at least from the operations perspective, that ICRC is implementing.
Wow, that's super inspiring and interesting. I heard about the production technique of using non-burned bricks, and this is, as you say, it's not a new thing. It's an old knowledge that now is reused again, and I think this applies very much to our approach to this, right? What is an innovation and what is new in this context? Many times it's knowledge that is there, is technology and products that are available. It's just how do we adapt them in a good and sustainable way, not from just an environmental perspective, but also that includes other aspects like inclusion of the local community, creating a better economy base in the local community, and contributing in many different levels. Also, your work in Sahel with providing more sustainable solutions for food access and so on is really, really interesting. Yes, go ahead, Anna.
No, I just wanted to actually add something on the new old technologies, because just one example more on our let's say premises. We had a situation in Niger where a storm destroyed our warehouse, very important warehouse where we kept medical supplies and food for Niger and Mali operations. And one of the first thoughts was, let's go for solar panels to power the cooling system in that warehouse. But then there was a reflection to actually go for these stabilized soil bricks. And also the technology to construct roofs like local people do in their houses, using straw and double layers to keep the right level and temperature in the warehouse. And it was a great success, and we included the local communities contributed to the local economy, and we achieved our objective. We have a warehouse that is perfectly functioning, and it was so successful that we actually built a second one in Niger using this technology, which is cheaper, greener, and also helping the local community. So that's definitely.
That's great. No, I recognize this and the discussion on passive cooling systems, right? Instead of having active ones that I mentioned before, right? And how it comes quite clear that it's not just about the technology. Obviously, we need to think broader than that. I think we have, or that Gemma is having some issues with connectivity, but I hope she will get back soon. So let's continue the two of us for now.
Sure.
And maybe then I can just jump into one project that we've been working on. I mentioned the solar air conditioning project before. Hi, Gemma. Welcome back.
I'm so sorry, my Wi-Fi
problem.
cut out.
No, so I was just starting to talk about one of the projects we worked around, right? And what we did here is that we saw that large parts of our emissions from field level or program level really linked to our need to cool down our operations, right? We need to have temperature control, as I said before, for operational theaters, for intensive care units, but also for pharmacies and different places, storage areas, and so on. To the extent that it's between 30 to 50% of our CO2 emissions are rendered from that. So what we started to do was really to look into how can we use other sources than generators, because in many places where we work there is no infrastructure, right? So we tested solar-driven air conditioners, and this is something that existed in the market, but even the producers of those solutions didn't know if it would work with direct solar power, because that was not a part of their regular market, so to speak. So we started a pilot in Haiti and tested this, and we saw that this is working and really has the possibility to cut down a lot of our emissions. One single unit could reduce about 1 to 2.5 CO2 metric tons of emissions per year, which is a lot, but it also comes with those aspects that you were talking about, Anna, right? That it's not just about installing air conditioners, even if it's solar driven, right? Because you need to think about many other things. One is, of course, passive cooling. So are there other alternatives, right? Do we even need it to begin with, right? You need to justify it. But also that it needs to have a multidisciplinary approach, right? We need to also include competences relating to construction. We need to insulate our structure as well, so to speak. And also, in addition, we need to have a good understanding on how to use this. It's really not very sensitive to use air conditioning systems if you have the window open, for example, right? So those kind of things. And this is how we really need to have a broader thinking within these areas. I'm gonna pass the mic over to you now that you're back, Emma, and we have you here. So hope we don't lose you again. But basically, just if you have some interesting examples from your organization that you want to share.
Yeah, sure. Very sorry that I cut out before, and sorry that I missed your presentation.
I'm sure you cannot help it.
Oh, goodness. I mean, Melbourne and the Wi-Fi is horrible. Anyway, yeah, happy to share from an IOM perspective. I think I've just jumped in on the end of what you were saying here, but we undertake a lot of technological innovations to promote the environment, solar water pumping, reducing carbon emissions, ensuring that wastewater runoff is clean before disposing it. Lots of different things to ensure that the environment is protected, but from a different level, I think one of the projects that we're working on, which I mentioned in the introduction, is our Innovation Norway funded e-waste project, which is looking at not only the technology to improve or green humanitarian response, but also looks at creating a circular economy through partnerships and through really changing the way that UN agencies procure products and influencing not only within the UN, but also manufacturers of those products and distributors of those products. I think as a UN organization and as humanitarian organizations collectively, we have a really large purchasing power and a large bargaining power if we are to influence, for example, the private sector. To speak a little bit more specifically about this project, it's looking at solar waste in displacement settings, and we're partnering with 3 different organisations. One that's looking at repairing batteries in camps from the solar Pico solar products. Our research showed that approximately 70% of solar products that are assumed to be end of life and disposed of actually can be repaired due to the battery. And so we're working with Total Energies to repair those batteries, also with Bright Products, who are solar distributors, to train technicians within the camps to repair the solar products rather than having people dispose of them. And in that way, we're really including the beneficiaries as well and tapping into the capacities and the local markets that already exist. There's lots of discussions at the moment around creating a circular economy, but if we don't bring in the people who already have the market and, you know, for example, the waste pickers within displacement settings, there's so many markets that already exist, and to create a truly circular economy, we really need to have everyone involved in that circle. Otherwise, we've just got lots of different circles and it's not effective. So this project is really looking at including the private sector and then the beneficiaries as well. It also has another aspect, which is procurement and looking at influencing sustainable procurement policies for UN. Yeah, so that's a bit of background on that project. Yeah, I guess the main thing is technologies are one thing, and I'm sure we'll talk about this in more detail, but it's really influencing from both the bottom-up and top-down approach that is going to have that really long-lasting change, I think.
Thanks a lot, Gemma. I think that you really brought up some really interesting points, and we have been discussing this also within our movement, of course, and it's the supply chain, right? I mean, one is how it really contributes to emissions and degradation of our environment. But the other one is, as you say, how can we create something that is of a more circular kind of economy? And this really links into the decolonization discussions also that we have, that like the imbalanced kind of distribution of where we purchase different items from, right? So if you can manage to create more local capacity, I think also that would lead to more robust networks, right? We know, of course, there are challenges with this, but I think that's a really interesting aspect. And then what you mentioned in the beginning also, to have a product life cycle approach, right? And I think that this is really an important area where at least I mean, the UN, of course, is a really big body that has a lot of influence. And I think that it could be even expanded if we see all the humanitarian actors, right, to really push producers to assure that they minimize the impact that their production, because it's many times in that part that we see it's the biggest part of emissions come from, but also other aspects, right? How are they produced from an ethical perspective, the labor, how the workers are treated, and so on. And now we are, of course, moving away a bit from the core topic, but they are all interlinked. That's maybe the point I want to have here, and also how we need to collaborate in certain areas to have impact, while on others we can work more independently. So I think that's super interesting to hear that. So we had some interesting examples already here, but as we know, it takes more than examples, it takes more than some innovations, right? We know projects are great, but to reach the impact, to finally have transformation on the way we work, we really need to scale what we do. And maybe beyond scaling, again, it's transformation, not just on how we do things, or prior to that also how we think as an organization. So I would like to also talk a bit about the limitations of what you have seen within the projects you have been working with, because I think that also gives us a good understanding of maybe what needs to be changed in order to achieve more long-term goals. Anyone feels the urge? Otherwise, I can start. Or Gemma, yeah?
Yeah, limitations. I think the vision is there, certainly. Even just speaking across our three organisations, there's a vision towards improving humanitarian response and making it greener. But I think the systems to get there still maybe are just on the cusp or not quite there yet. Speaking specifically for the e-waste project that I've just spoken about, it was really challenging to partner with private companies because we speak such different languages, and it was quite new for us. And the policies, procedures, templates everything that operated in a more traditional way, we had to adapt for this specific project. It was a pilot, and I hope that we have paved the way for future partnerships with the private sector within IOM and other UN organisations. But I think just having those new sort of innovative partnerships is getting different sectors to speak the same language is quite challenging.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, even within the organization itself, it can be challenging, right? Depending on what part of the organization, and especially as we know, it's often a multidisciplinary approach you need to have, or almost always, right? So even to take that outside of the organization and outside of the sector, it's really tricky. Any other limitations or challenges, Anna?
Yeah, I could add a few. I mean, at ICRC is at the stage where we want to really step up our transition to the more environment and climate ready organization. And we actually, our journey has started in 2007. So it's been a while. We have the vision, we have the strategy, the framework, and so on. So we know what we're aiming at, what is our direction, and so on. And now we're looking at enablers, what is needed to step up and make all these beautiful pilots and efforts that we've been implementing for so long in different areas to be more systematic and more structured at the organizational level. And I think some of the limitations, that start with limitations, things that are a bit in our ways, for example, resourcing, obviously, and the funding, but this is something we would like to tackle with the Climate and Environment Fund that we'll be launching next year. And this is going to be central mechanism in this transition. It will support different environment and climate change activities worldwide for the ICRC. We are present in more than 19 countries, so very different contexts. And basically, the idea is that this fund would be free from this annual budget dynamic and not redirecting money that is supposed to be used for humanitarian response, but finding different funding sources to basically integrate climate and environmental considerations in all of our activities. And linked to that, I mentioned different contexts and complexity of this context. This is one of the limitations as well sometimes, because in some countries we just the sustainable solutions don't work, or there's no market for sustainable solutions and technologies, products, or no know-how in the country. So this can be sometimes an obstacle. The easiest example is also e-waste, or like plastic waste, where there's no infrastructure in the countries to deal with this waste sustainably. So this is something that is actually has been identified as an environmental hotspot for the ICRC, and we are working on these topics. But another very important element is that, okay, we have our ambitions, our targets. As I mentioned, as part of the charter, we have ambitions targets to reduce our emissions 50% by 2030 compared to 2018 levels, and integrate the environmental and climate considerations in all of our programs by 2025. So we know our ambitions, we know our targets, and so the funding element I mentioned as well. But the next thing that is very important is the staff capacity and knowledge and skills and even awareness to be able to translate these ambitions and translate these objectives and integrate them into their day-to-day work. So we have done some work in that area. We have developed the Sustainable Development in Humanitarian Action online course that was actually open to everybody. Everybody could have, and still it's open on the FutureLearn platform that can be accessed by anybody. And this basically summarizes our journey from when we started about towards sustainability and summarizing all the best practices that we've gathered along the time over time. And there's quite a lot because we started 2007 and have been gathering the experiences, had a lot of organic pilot projects, some very good practices in our operations, which have been actually listed in a sort of like a framework, environmental management framework for operations. And so this is in a lot of experience that we are willing to share with other organizations and learn from our other organizations. And I think that this is actually a very important element to cooperate, to collaborate, share what we have learned so we don't duplicate efforts. And one of the good examples is actually the Sustainable Supply Chain Alliance that ICRC and I4C are leading, basically to see how we can improve our environmental impact in the supply chain, because actually there's it's a big chunk of carbon emissions and impact actually comes from the supply chains and the items that we purchase and services and so on. So there's a lot of areas that we are exploring as part of this collaboration. We're looking at the design of products, so we can look how we can reduce the environmental and social impact of these products. We're looking at our fleet optimization. We're looking at sustainable purchasing policies, and I've been working on a very interesting project that we are piloting right now, buying RSPO, so Roundtable Sustainable Palm Oil, certified oil, which is distributed in our top consuming delegations, the ones that distribute the most palm oil, which is quite a controversial product with a high environmental impact. So there's a lot of things happening in different organizations, and so there's a need for these platforms to actually exchange knowledge, exchange practices, so that we can work together towards improving the sector generally, the humanitarian sector.
Thanks, Anna. No, so I hear you. I mean, disregarded that there are a lot of challenges. The interesting thing is also that we continuously learn as an organization and as a sector, right? That we start with some low-hanging fruits, right, on how we can reduce our CO2 emissions, how we can really improve. And in this journey, we really expand the knowledge. And I think this is also goes a bit into the cultural mindset within the organization and the sector. And besides that, also really hear you when you talk about the resource allocation, because this cannot also just happen by itself. We really need to invest in it. So the discussion within MSF has been more or less the same as I hear you talk now, right, on how to really identify earmarked resources that doesn't compete with operational resources, right? Because then it's a very tough choice for people at operational level. But also these funding cycles that are on 1 year, how we can change them, because sometimes if we stick to the example that I'm most familiar with, right, like more sustainable energy solutions, solar panels and systems. I mean, it's quite a heavy one-time investment, but in the long run, it's often much cheaper. So I think this is a super important area amongst all the other stuff you also mentioned. But I think that one interesting question here that just came in is really one of those basics, I would say, is how do we cap, for example, how much we fly? This was within MSF, and I imagine within other organizations, one of the big reasons for emissions, right? Both when it comes to people flying, but also air flights. So how are you working with that, Gemma?
I don't think that I'm qualified to answer this question, to be totally honest with you. I would assume that IOM are minimizing flights as much as possible. Certainly we've learned how to do that within the last 2 years, as everyone has. But yeah, I wouldn't be able to answer this question. I'm sorry. I might pass over to Anna if she knows better for ICRC.
No problem. Sorry for putting you on the spot. Of course, it's not necessarily
worries.
our area of expertise. So Anna, maybe the same for you, or do you have an idea?
Yeah, I mean, for the ICRC, as I mentioned, actually the travel is not the main concern, because we have recently developed a very detailed carbon accounting methodology and a tool, and we have done the inventories for 3 years now. And actually, the supply chain, as I mentioned before, nevertheless, what the ICRC is going to do, and we started working on that, is developing a concrete roadmap, like a concrete action plan to see where the greenhouse gas reductions would make more sense, will be more feasible, and looking at where the impact is actually the heaviest, which will be obviously a challenge, but this is a process that will be launching very soon. And from there, we will be developing concrete reduction strategies.
Thank you. I mean, from our side, yes, we have travel policies. Of course, they are not the same for the full movement, but in general, it's there. And also as a part of the environmental impact toolkit created by the Climate Smart TIC, this is one of the things that we measure, both at HQ level and at program level. Obviously, at program level, it can be more difficult to reduce the amount of flights, but within HQ flights, there was definitely a big amount of flights that could be cut down, and has been and started to do before the COVID-19 pandemic, obviously, right? Because that, yeah, nobody flew basically after that. But we saw that that was already ongoing, and just to also maybe, I think it can be used as a good example on how things can change, right? Because it's not just about the policy there, hey, you're not allowed to fly if you can take the train and it's just a 4-hour train ride, for example, right? It's also the fact that for me before, personally, I flew because I felt I had to. I had to be in a workshop, I don't know, in Brussels or somewhere else. And during this period now that we have been living with the pandemic, suddenly people are much more used to know, why should we meet? We can just do this online and we can have a workshop with me or Mural or whatever, right? And that wasn't because the technology wasn't really there, it's because we have changed the mindset on this, right? And I think that that shows us that this can happen in so many other areas. It's just that we are still thinking in a certain way, but it can be changed. So I think that's an interesting example on how we can reduce. And also beyond the personal flights, I know that some parts of the organization has really shifted from air flights into boat transports. And actually the fear there in the beginning was that it would take too long time and so on, but in the end it turned out it didn't, and it drastically reduced our CO2 emissions, right? It's a lot about planning. And I think this also brings back between the two over focus on a technical product, but also how we use those products in a more holistic way, and back to how we cool our operations. I know one example is from the pharmacies, and how we store different temperature sensitive equipment. So in some places we had the same temperature for the full compound, right? Where you have cold chain product and cool chain product. The difference being between 2 to 8 degrees or 15 to 25 degrees, right? So things like, okay, so separate those areas that can seem pretty basic, but they're not done all the time. So it really doesn't matter if you have a super sustainable solution if you're not getting those things right? Really thinking about how to plan things and to have more efficient solutions. But anyway, moving on a bit, we have around 12 minutes left. So I also want to ask the audience to keep posting questions, and we will read them up just before we quit. But then if I would, and I know this is a bit tricky, but just to push it a bit. So if we are going to scale, if we're going to transform ourselves, I'm going to read up a couple of ingredients that are needed. I would say probably you need to have many of them, but just to ask you, which one is the most important one? If you would start with leadership support, right? So it's clear leadership. Or do you need, secondly, clear direction or where you're going? Or would you need baseline data? Or is it resources, as you mentioned before, Anna, right? And this is financial and HR. Is it the cultural mindset? Or is it the operational buy-in? Or is it something else? And maybe it's something else. So again, to the audience, please put in the chat if you have some other ingredients that we need to have in order to transform ourselves. Gemma, any of those that you would pick in front of the others?
Certainly not. I think I touched before on the idea of a circular economy, and I think the interlinkages the environment has with so many different aspects of life, and needing both a top-down and bottom-up approach just shows that everything that you've just mentioned is really, really critical. Top-down and bottom-up, but also multi-sectoral as well. So essentially, we just need really joined-up approaches with stakeholders across multiple sectors, and really looking at, as we've mentioned, the technologies, but also governance, and ensuring that the enabling environment really supports the use of those technologies, to ensure that they have the positive impacts that they promise. An enabling environment can include things like culture, behaviour change, but also right up to legislation and policies and procurement and things we've spoken about today. So in a short answer to your question, I don't think I could prioritise one over the other from your list.
All right. Anna, can you?
I don't think so, but what I would say is that it also depends where you are in the sustainability journey, because I would say if you're at the beginning, the leadership support is the first thing you need to get to actually move with anything, to implement anything, because with commitment of the leadership come resources, there comes a vision, there comes a strategy. And so I think this is the first step normally in the journey. I think we are farther away right now, but as an organization, but I would say it also depends on where you are in, at which stage of your journey.
Couldn't agree more. So at the stage you're now at, Anna, what is it that you need most then? Because you mentioned already, need for earmarked fundings, for example, HR. Would you still stick to that, or something else you would want to lift up in your situation?
Yeah, so I think it's the funding, and we are already seeing how we can address it with this climate and environment fund. And as I said, operationalizing our ambitions, our targets, how do we want to achieve it? Because it's a bit, these ambitions and strategies are defined at the headquarter level, and the way we operate at ICRC is just that um, the management of delegations in the country offices, they also have to find a way to actually see how this fits in the operations in the context of the country. So I think this takes time, obviously some buy-in, operational buy-in as well. So this is a process that we need time and conversations and collaborations to figure out how to implement the roadmaps that are decided. And so I think this is where we are right now. So the funding, getting people on board, accompanying them in developing the right skills, the right knowledge, and making our efforts more standard and systematic. And that goes from the monitoring to implementation, and then follow up, and also data collection. So yes, there's quite a lot of elements, but I think this first stage of leadership commitment, the vision, developing the strategy, gathering the first experiences, and testing solutions, we have that. It's just now a matter of stepping up our game.
Thanks, Anna. Gemma, so if you would say also from that kind of framing, where you are now, what would you need most at this point?
I agree that we have the vision. Potentially, you were talking earlier about a baseline assessment. I think really understanding where the gaps are and what the needs are. That if there's lots of different initiatives happening individually, it might not be beneficial. So really understanding across the whole sector, where are the gaps and what do we need to focus on to ensure that everyone's efforts are put to the best use. So probably, a sufficient gap analysis, and then directing resources into the right spots, not only having the resources.
Thanks. So I'm going to bring up a question. Are there initiatives to exchange information on innovative approaches among humanitarian organizations? I know definitely there are a couple of them relating to energy transition matters, like Energypedia. They have continuous webinars on the topic. I also know another humanitarianenergy.org, where there are different exchange within this area. And you mentioned a couple of them also, Anna Livak. for example, the Supply Chain Alliance. Other examples that you would like to bring forward here?
So you mentioned the baseline, and actually this reminds me of a project that we are working on. So this actually stems from the fact that we created the carbon accounting tool for our organization. It's very comprehensive. It includes all three scopes of emissions, and there's been an interest in the sector and from other humanitarian organizations to learn from us, and we created this working group and launched this project to develop a carbon accounting tool for all humanitarian organizations, actually, to have the comparison, the benchmarking opportunity in the future, but also have the consistent methodology in the sector to take into account these particularities, because it's not as straightforward when it comes to carbon accounting when it's private sector where things are generated for income. We are humanitarian organizations and have very different operations activities. So this is a very interesting cooperation as well about developing a carbon accounting tool for humanitarian organizations.
Thanks. Gemma, do you have any good suggestions on exchange information on innovative approaches?
Yeah, under the the Innovation Norway funding that we have under the Humanitarian Innovation Program, we're working with the other funded projects under that, and we meet on a monthly basis and discuss how they're going within that funding, and share ideas on innovation, on partnering with the private sector. Not necessarily similar projects, we're all working on really different things, but just sharing ideas about, I guess, how to encourage that within the sector.
Thanks. I think we got a really interesting question here also, so I'm going to read that one up. Is where would you like to be in 5 or 10 years? Any vision how sustainable humanitarian action looks like then? And I'm even going to put it on a 10 years, so we have some time, some more time.
I will repeat myself, but here I think this is very well defined in the charter that I mentioned, where there's 7 commitments for the humanitarian sector. And they cover different topics, and I don't know all of them by heart, but I can mention a few. So first is to step up our response to growing humanitarian needs, to help people adapt to the impacts of climate change, to maximize the environmental sustainability of our work, to embrace the leadership of local actors and communities in that journey, to increase our capacity to understand climate and environmental risk and develop evidence-based solutions, work collaboratively across the humanitarian sector and beyond to strengthen climate and environmental action, and use our influence to mobilize urgent and more ambitious climate action and environmental protection, and develop targets and measure our progress as we implement our commitments. And actually on the website of the climate charter, the roadmap is more detailed. So if you're interested, you can have a look and read in more detail. But for us as the organization, we have clear targets, which what I mentioned before, one about the carbon emission reductions by 50%, and also integrating environmental and climate risks in all of our programs. So that will help us to not only to reduce our environmental impact, but also to prepare to respond to the growing needs of people that we serve.
So follow-up question quickly before passing it on to you, Gemma. Sorry, will we be there? Okay. How will we have reached that in 10 years?
We'll see. That's the ambition, and I think, well, we set our targets for ourselves, so I believe we have we are on a good path to achieve them, and things are happening already. There are concrete steps being taken, so yes, I believe so.
Thanks, Anna. Gemma?
Yeah, I can't add too much to what Anna said. I think that it would look great if that's what the sector looked like. I would also like to see sustainability as a cross-cutting issue and seeing how or evidence how it's impacting on other sectors such as livelihood or gender. There are numerous examples where, for example, I think UNDP were undertaking a project in Jordan where Syrian women would repair solar panels, but the Jordan women couldn't. But then eventually by the end of this project, the Jordan women were able to repair the solar panels. So it was just one example of how sustainability and looking at environmental impacts can have further impacts on things like livelihoods and gender. And it would be great to see not only the objectives that Anna just spoke about seen, but also how the environment or these environmental objectives are influencing the wider sector as well.
Thank you very much. And I think that will be the final thoughts of today. We have just hit 16:00 CET. So thank you very much for participating in today's session on how we can do what greener humanitarian activities looks like. I think it's been super interesting. A big thanks to all of you there listening to this, and especially those posting questions. We're going to wrap up now, and just to also remind you that there is one more session left today. It's about the universal right to social protection by 2030, humanitarian pathways to support national